The phone rang in James Peterson's small apartment. He slowly opened his eyes, the morning sunlight filtering through the window, creating dim streaks of light on the wall. At the age of 68, waking up every morning is a challenge with dry and stiff joints. But today is different. A special day that he has been waiting for the past 40 years. James reached for the ringing phone. The screen displayed the number of Sarah, his only daughter. "Dad, I'm just calling to remind you not to forget today's appointment. I know how important it is to you." Sarah's warm voice rang out from the other end of the line. "Thank you, daughter," James smiled. "How could I forget? I've been waiting for this day for so long." He looked at the ash-gray suit hanging carefully on the hanger. His best suit, neatly ironed last night. Next to it is an old, discolored photo, an image of a small auto repair shop with a Peterson's Auto Repair sign on the roof. It was his family's inheritance, where he spent his entire youth building, until... James shook his head, trying to banish the painful memories. He slowly walked into the bathroom. The warm steam from the shower soothed the pain in his knees. The familiar scent of soap, a mixture of lavender and cedar, spreads in the small space. He carefully shaved, his old fingers moving the razor skillfully, according to decades of habit. When he looked in the mirror, James saw a weathered face with deep wrinkles around the eyes and corners of the mouth, traces of time and hard years. His silver hair was neatly combed back, revealing a broad forehead with deep wrinkles of thought. The blaring sound of car horns from the street below echoed through the half-open bathroom window. New York has woken up, and with it, the millions of dreams and hopes of its people. James smiled. Today, he also had his own dream. The gray suit fits James's slim body perfectly. He stood in front of the mirror, meticulously tying his navy blue tie, the last birthday gift from his late wife. Janet has been gone for 5 years, but sometimes he still hears her clear laughter echoing in this apartment. "You look so handsome," James could imagine Janet saying, with that warm smile that he loved. She was always his strongest supporter, even in his darkest days. James reached for an old leather briefcase containing important documents that he had carefully prepared. The familiar smell of genuine leather emanates, a rare item left over from the heyday of the Peterson Auto Repair Shop. He once again checked the contents of the documents, bank statements, property documents, and especially the check with the number he had accumulated over the past 4 decades. As he walked out of the apartment, James took a deep breath. The city's morning air, a mixture of car exhaust, the smell of baking bread from the bakery down the street, and the typical humidity of a New York fall, filled his chest. This is the day when you will get it all back, or lose it all. The taxi took him to the door of Sterling Car Dealership, a modern glass and steel building on 5th Avenue. This place has changed a lot from 40 years ago, when it was an auto repair shop. Little of the Peterson family. James felt his heart beat faster as he walked through the automatic glass door. Inside, the large space displays brand new cars with bright LED lights. The smell of new leather and car perfume emanates from luxury cars. Soft music plays from the sound system, mixed with the conversation of sales staff and customers. "How can I help you?" A young salesman approached, his eyes quickly evaluating James's old suit. His smile seemed somewhat fake, as if it had been practiced 100 times in front of a mirror. "I want to see Mr. Marcus Sterling," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you have an appointment?" the salesperson asked, doubt evident on his face. "Yes, 10 a.m., James replied, clutching his leather briefcase tightly. "Tell him James Peterson wants to meet." As the salesperson turned away to check the appointment, James looked around the showroom. A feeling of pain flashed through his heart when he realized that the corner where his father's small office used to be had now been replaced by a luxurious coffee shop. Memories of the mechanic's laughter, the smell of oil, and the sound of the car engine echoed in his mind. "Mr. Peterson," a voice interrupted James's thoughts. He turned around and faced Marcus Sterling, the man who bought his family's repair shop 40 years ago at a cheap price. Taking advantage of a time when his family was having financial difficulties, Marcus Sterling still maintains a luxurious appearance even though he is over 70. The expensive suit and gold Rolex watch on his wrist reflect who he is. A successful businessman constantly expanding his car empire across the world. Other people's backs. "Shall we go into my office to talk?" Sterling smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. James nodded and silently followed the rich man into the private elevator leading to the top floor of the building. Sterling's office is the embodiment of power and wealth. Panoramic views of Manhattan, rich wood furniture, and expensive paintings on the walls. The scent of cedar wood from the scented candles blends with the genuine leather smell of the luxurious sofa set. "So, Mr. Peterson," Sterling sat down in the leather chair behind the desk. "I'm really curious about the reason for this meeting. After all these years..." James placed the leather briefcase on the table, slowly opened it, and took out a folder of documents. "I'm here to buy back my family's repair shop, Marcus." He spoke, his voice low and sure. Sterling laughed, the sound echoing in the large room. "The repair shop? Mr. Peterson, perhaps you haven't realized. This is no longer a small repair shop. This is one of the largest car dealerships in New York." "I know," James replied calmly. "And I also know its true value." He placed a check on the table. $50 million. That's the current market value of this land, plus 20% as compensation for what you've invested in it. Sterling picked up the check, his expression turning from mockery to surprise. "How did you get this money?" 40 years of hard work, saving every penny, investing wisely, James said. "I swore to my father on his deathbed that one day I would take back what belonged to the Peterson family. And today is that day." The atmosphere in the room suddenly became tense. Sterling put down the check and leaned back in his chair. "You think it's that simple, Peterson? I could refuse to sell, you know." "Maybe," James nodded, "but you won't." He took out another set of documents from his briefcase. "Because I have these things, the evidence of how you defrauded my family 40 years ago, of fake contracts and rigged debts. I've been quietly collecting them for years." Sterling's face turned pale. He reached for the glass of whiskey on the table, and James could see that his hands were shaking slightly. "Are you threatening me?" "No, I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing," James said, without any anger in his voice. $50 million, a clean transaction, no one gets hurt. Or we can let the lawyers and the press decide the true value of these documents." Sterling was silent for a long time, his eyes thoughtfully looking out the wide window. The afternoon sunlight has begun to turn yellow, covering the city with a beautiful pale orange color. Finally, he sighed, a heavy sound of defeat. "You know, Peterson," Sterling looked back at James, "I've always wondered when this day would come. Maybe I've known all along that what I did to your family wasn't right." James did not respond. He just sat there, quietly watching the man who once took away his family's dream gradually crumble before him. "I'll sign the papers," Sterling said after a moment of silence. "But I want to know, after all these years, what keeps you so persistent?" James pulled an old photo from his wallet. the image of his father standing proudly in front of the Peterson repair shop on opening day. "This isn't just about money, Marcus. This is about honor, about promises, and about doing the right thing. My father taught me that a real man never gives up what I believe." Sterling nodded slowly, perhaps for the first time truly understanding the person sitting in front of him. He reached for the pen and signed the documents that James had prepared. When he walked out of the Sterling Motors building, James felt like an invisible burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The late afternoon sunlight shines down on the streets of Manhattan, reflecting on high-rise windows. The sound of car horns and the noise of the city seems to have become gentler. He stopped at the corner, where the entrance to the Peterson repair shop used to be. The smell of baking bread from a nearby bakery mingles with car exhaust and the humidity of a New York fall afternoon. James closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could hear his father's laughter, the echo of the car engine, and the familiar smell of oil from the old days. He took out his phone and called Sarah. "Daughter," he said, his voice a little choked. "I did it. Peterson Repair will be back." Sarah's sobbing voice rang out from the other end of the line. "Oh, Dad, Mom and Grandpa would be so proud of you." James smiled, wiping away the tears that had just rolled down his cheeks. "I know, dear daughter. I know." As the sunset blanketed New York City, James Peterson knew this was not the end, but a new beginning. Tomorrow, he will begin the revival of the Peterson repair shop, not with revenge or bitterness, but with the pride and honor his father passed down. Because sometimes, dreams take more than just time to come true. They also take patience, courage, and a heart that never gives up believing. The sound of hammers and drills echoed in the large space of the building being renovated. James Peterson stood amid a pile of rubble and metal plates, sweat beading on his forehead even though it was autumn. The smell of fresh paint and construction dust filled the air, but to him, it was the scent of hope and new beginnings. "Dad, they just shipped in the latest diagnostic equipment," Sarah said, holding a thick file. His daughter resigned from her law firm to help her father rebuild the family business. But the cost was about 30% higher than we expected. James wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving behind a trail of gray dust. "It's okay, daughter. We can't ignore technology. Times are different. A modern repair shop needs the best equipment." The sound of hurried footsteps sounded from the door. Mike Chen, a young engineer that James had just recruited, ran over with a worried look on his face. "Mr. Peterson, we have a problem with the building permit. The Department of Buildings says our renovation plan violates some new safety regulations." James felt a familiar pain throbbing in his knee as he sat down on a nearby toolbox. The faint smell of motor oil and metal in the air reminded him of the old days when his father still ran this repair shop. "How much time do we need to adjust the plan?" James asked, his voice calm even though his insides were churning with anxiety. Every day of delay means additional costs and further distance from the expected opening date. "At least 2 weeks to get the blueprints drawn up and approved," Mike replied, fiddling with his pencil nervously. "And that means we have to stop all construction work until we get a new permit." Sarah sat down next to her father, placing her hand on his shoulder. James could smell his daughter's gentle perfume, the same scent as his mother used to have. "Dad," she said softly, "maybe it's time we should call Marcus Sterling." James turned around to look at his daughter, surprised. "Sterling? Why?" "He's been running this place for 40 years, Dad. He must know the building regulations well and has connections with the Department of Buildings. Maybe it's time we let the past is behind." James looked out the window, where the afternoon sunlight was casting orange-yellow rays onto the high-rise buildings of Manhattan. The noise of the city echoed. Car horns, passers-by, construction machinery, all blending into the familiar music of New York. He stood up and walked to the wall where his father's old photo still hung. In the photo, a man with gray hair is smiling proudly in front of the Peterson repair shop on its first opening day. James could feel the warmth from that smile, even after all these years. "You know," James said, his voice thoughtful, "once upon a time, when the repair shop was in trouble, I refused to ask anyone for help. He thought it showed weakness." He turned to look at Sarah and Mike. "And that's why we lost everything." Sarah stood up and hugged her father from behind. "Father." "But now I understand," James continued. "Sometimes true strength lies in knowing when to ask for help. Maybe it's time we learn to forgive, not just Sterling, and for ourselves." Mike pulled out his phone. "I have Mr. Sterling's office number here." James nodded. "Call." He held Sarah's hand tightly. "We will rebuild the Peterson factory, not with bitterness and hatred, but with wisdom and tolerance." The call to Sterling's office was quick. That afternoon, Marcus Sterling was personally present at the construction site, wearing an expensive suit, but showing no signs of discomfort with the surrounding dirt. "I've been waiting for this call," Sterling said as he shook James's hand. "I know you'll need help with all this bureaucratic paperwork. They've been changing the rules all the time in recent years." James observed the man who had once been his enemy. Under the setting sun, he noticed new wrinkles on Sterling's face, signs of age, and perhaps years of living with guilt. "Why do you want to help us?" James asked frankly. Sterling was silent for a moment, looking around the space being renovated. "Maybe because I want to atone for some of my mistakes," he finally said. "Or maybe because I remember the feeling when an old father puts his trust in his son." He looked towards Sarah. "You're a lawyer, right? I think we can work this out together." Over the next 2 hours, Sterling shared with them his experiences and connections. He knows exactly who to meet, what documents to prepare, and how to speed up the approval process. When Sterling left, the sun had set behind the tall buildings, leaving the last rays of sunlight tinting the New York sky red. James stood alone in the quiet space of the repair workshop under construction. The smell of fresh paint and construction dust now mixed with the scent of coffee left behind by the Sterling cup, a scent of unexpected collaboration. "Dad," Sarah called from behind, "I just received an email from the Department of Construction. They will review our application tomorrow." James nodded and smiled. In his head, his father's voice echoed, "Son, in business as well as in life, sometimes our biggest enemy is not other people, but our own arrogance." That night, when James returned to his small apartment, he spent time sitting by the window, looking out at the brightly lit city. The noise of the city has subsided, leaving only the gentle hum of sparse cars and the sound of the autumn wind blowing through the windows. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the drink his father often used on sleepless nights. The smell of strong alcohol wafted through the air, bringing with it memories of evenings sitting next to my father, listening to stories about career and life. "I understand, Father," James whispered into the darkness. "Sometimes, to rebuild what has been lost, we must learn to rebuild ourselves." He took a sip of whiskey, letting the spicy flavor spread in his mouth. Tomorrow will be a new day, with new challenges. But for the first time in many years, James Peterson feels like he's truly on the right track, not just in rebuilding the repair shop, but in healing the wounds of the past. A week before opening day, the first fall storm hit New York. Heavy raindrops hit the newly installed glass windows of the Peterson workshop, creating a sound like rhythmic drumming. James Peterson stood in his new office, which used to be his father's office many years ago, listening to the sound of rain mixed with the sound of machinery and the voices of employees rushing to complete the final stages. "Mr. Peterson," Mike Chen's voice called out from below the workshop, "we have a problem with the new batch of equipment." James quickly walked down the stairs, his knee aching slightly out of habit. The smell of new paint and motor oil mixed together, creating a familiar scent that he has remembered for the past 40 years. Mike was standing next to a large box that had just been opened, his youthful face wrinkled with worry. "They sent the wrong model. This is an older version than what we ordered." Sarah, sitting at the new reception desk, looked up from her computer screen. "Does that mean we have to postpone the opening?" James walked closer to the container, carefully checking the specifications. The smell of new cardboard and plastic wrap permeates the humid air of a rainy day. Through the large window, lightning flashed, followed by thunder that echoed throughout Manhattan. "No," James said finally. "We're not postponing." He turned to Mike. "Can you work with this device?" Mike nodded, though still looking nervous. "Maybe, but it's not as modern as what we advertise to customers." "Then we'll tell them the truth," James said, his voice calm. "Peterson's never lies to customers. That was my father's principle, and will continue to be ours." At that moment, the front glass door opened. A cold wind carried raindrops inside. Marcus Sterling walked in, his expensive suit soaking wet, but his eyes lit up when he saw the renovated space. "Impressive, Peterson," Sterling said, looking around. "But I heard you guys are having trouble with the equipment?" James looked at the old man with surprise. "News spreads quickly, doesn't it?" Sterling smiled. "I still have some contacts in the industry. Look, I can help you get the right model equipment within 3 days." "No need," James shook his head. "We'll handle this ourselves." "Peterson," Sterling sighed, "haven't you learned your lesson about accepting help?" Sarah walked over and put her hand on her father's shoulder. "Dad, maybe we should—" "No," James interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "This isn't about pride, baby. This is about starting the right way." He turned to Sterling. "I know you have good intentions, Marcus, but Peterson's needs to face this first challenge on his own." Sterling was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand, but at least let me share some experience on how to handle this situation." For the next 2 hours, Sterling sat with them in the conference room, sharing stories about similar difficulties he had experienced and how he had resolved them. The smell of hot coffee from the new brewer spreads in the space, mingling with the sound of falling rain and thunder in the distance. When Sterling left, the rain had stopped. The sunset filtered through the scattered clouds, creating brilliant orange streaks on the Manhattan skyline. James stood by the office window, looking at the drops of water remaining on the glass, reflecting the streetlights that had just turned on. "Dad," Sarah called softly, "I just talked to the marketing team. They suggested we could turn this situation into a strong position." "How?" "By spreading the word about the integrity of Peterson's, about how we choose to tell our customers the truth instead of hiding, about how we put honor and trust above profits." James smiled, remembering what his father often said. "In business, you can lose everything and rebuild from scratch. But once you lose your honor, you will never be able to get it back." That night, when most of the staff had left, James was still sitting in the office. He took out an old bottle of whiskey, a gift from Sterling, and poured 2 glasses. Mike Chen is still tinkering with the new device, trying to optimize its performance. "Mike," James called, Come up here and have a drink with me." The young engineer looked up in surprise, then quickly packed up his tools and walked up to the office. The smell of motor oil and sweat emanating from him mixed into the warm air of the room. "You know," James said as Mike sat down, "there are moments in life, challenges that seem like barriers, but are actually opportunities for us to redefine who we are." Mike took a sip of whiskey, a bit hesitantly. "You think this is one of those moments?" "That's right," James nodded. "Sometimes, not having the best forces us to be the best." He looked out the window, where the city lights sparkled in the night like stars. "My father built Peterson's from scratch. He didn't have the most modern equipment, but he had something more important: the trust of his customers." Mike was silent for a moment, then suddenly stood up. "I have an idea," he said, his eyes lighting up. "We can tweak this device, add some features that the new version doesn't have. I've been researching this. It will take a lot of work, but it can be done." James looked at the young man, seeing in him the image of himself in the past: passion, determination, and the spirit of never giving up in the face of difficulties. "How much time will you need?" 3 days, maybe 4. I'll work all night if I have to." James stood up and put his hand on Mike's shoulder. "No, we're going to do this together. Peterson's has always been a family, and family never lets anyone fight alone." Through the window, a new moon had just emerged from behind the scattered clouds of the storm. Silver light reflects on the water droplets remaining on the glass, creating sparkling spots like diamonds. James looked down at the vast repair shop below, where cars were waiting to be taken care of, and new tools were waiting to be serviced. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we begin writing a new chapter in the history of Peterson's." Mike raised his glass. "Because of Peterson's?" James smiled, clinking glasses with the young man. "No, because dreams never die, and people never give up on making them come true." The sound of clinking glasses rang out in the dead of night, like a promise, a new beginning, and a belief in good things to come. The dawn of opening day covered Manhattan in a gentle pink color. James Peterson stood in front of the ornately decorated Peterson's repair shop, caressing the newly installed brass sign, an exact replica of the sign his father had hung 40 years before. The smell of morning dew mixed with the scent of coffee from the cafe opposite, creating a quiet atmosphere before the city really woke up. "Grandpa would be so proud of this place," Sarah said, walking up beside her father. She wore an elegant business suit, but her carefully polished shoes were reminiscent of the way her grandfather used to take care of every smallest detail. James smiled, looking at his daughter in the dawn light. "You know, there were moments when I thought I could hear your grandfather's laughter echoing through the workshop." The familiar sound of a car engine sounded from afar. Marcus Sterling's classic Rolls-Royce slowly approached, the engine humming in perfect harmony. Sterling stepped out of the car, still in his familiar expensive suit, but this time with a small, carefully wrapped package. "I think this is a good time to return this," Sterling said, handing the package to James. Inside is a silver pocket watch, a family memento that James's father had to sell during the most difficult days. James held the watch in his hand, feeling the coldness of the metal and the small scratches on the surface, traces of time and memory. "You kept it all these years?" "I always knew the day would come when I had to return it to where it belonged," Sterling said softly, his voice filled with something close to remorse. Mike Chen appeared at the door, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Everything is ready. The new equipment works perfectly, even better than we expected." James looked at the clock. There were 30 minutes left until opening time. Groups of people began to gather outside, former customers of Peterson's, area residents, and even local reporters. The air was filled with excitement and anticipation. Inside the workshop, everything is shiny and perfect. The new leather smell of the waiting chairs blends with the gentle smell of engine oil, creating a space that is both professional and familiar. Natural light pours through large glass windows, reflecting on meticulously cared-for equipment. "Hey!" a weak voice said from the door. James turned around and was surprised to see Frank Wilson, the old mechanic who had worked with his father since the early days. The old man is over 80 years old and has to use a cane to walk, but his eyes still light up when he sees the repair workshop. "Frank!" James went to hug the old mechanic. The familiar smell of cigarettes on Frank's shirt evokes thousands of memories of the old days. "I can't miss this day," Frank said, his voice choking. "Joe, your father. He always believed that one day the Petersons would return." Sarah gave Frank a chair, and the old mechanic sat down, constantly looking around. "You guys have done great things here, but more importantly, you've kept the spirit of Petersons alive." At exactly 9 a.m., James stepped out into the waiting crowd. The gentle autumn sunlight shines down, making the new bronze sign sparkle. He stood there, feeling hundreds of eyes looking at him. But in that moment, he only saw his father's face reflected in the glass. "Peterson's is more than just a repair shop," James began his speech, his deep voice echoing in the quiet space. "This is a story about trust, about honor, and about never giving up on the values we believe in." He talked about the history of Peterson's, about his father, about the difficult years, and about the journey back. He talks about learning to forgive, about the power of sincerity, and about the true meaning of success. "We may not have the most expensive equipment," James said, glancing toward Mike, who was standing proudly next to the technical area, "but we have the most dedicated and caring people. Most importantly, we have your trust." When James cut the opening ribbon, applause echoed throughout the space. Sarah hugged her father, tears rolling down her cheeks. Sterling stood in the corner, smiling and nodding. Frank Wilson stood up, slowly clapping his hands, tears in his old eyes. Customers began to flood into the factory. The sounds of chatter, the sound of machines operating, and laughter mixed together, creating the familiar music that James has remembered for the past 40 years. At the end of the day, when the last guests had left, James sat in his father's old office. The brilliant sunset shines through the window, tinting the space red. He took out the returned Sterling pocket watch, opened the lid, and looked at the small photo inside. A picture of his father, and him taken on the first opening day of Peterson's. Sarah walked in and placed a cup of hot coffee in front of her father. "The first day was a huge success," she said. "We've got over 20 repair contracts." James nodded, but his eyes were still glued to the old photo. "You know, Sarah, for years I thought my goal was to get this repair shop back. But now I understand that was never the most important thing." "So what's most important, Dad?" James looked up at his daughter, a warm smile on his lips. "It's about holding fast to the values your grandfather taught you. It's about understanding that true success is not measured by what you have, but by how you achieve it. It's about knowing that honor and trust are important, more important than any number on the books." Sarah sat down next to her father, resting her head on his shoulder. Through the open window, they could hear the noise of Manhattan at night, car horns, people passing by, and somewhere in the distance, church bells ringing in the dusk. "I think Grandpa is looking down at us from somewhere," Sarah whispered. "I'm sure of that," James replied, squeezing his daughter's hand. "And I think he's smiling." Outside, the first lights of Manhattan began to shine, like thousands of stars waking up. A new day is coming to an end, but for the Petersons, this is just the beginning. A beginning built not only with steel and glass, but also with honor, trust, and love. Eternal values that no time can erase.